In our first video, we discussed how America faces these repeated educational crises, and how the most basic communication principle of meaning being fundamentally shared is foundational and an all too often overlooked element. I will now dovetail in another related angle. Sense of inclusion. In recent years, this sense of inclusion metric has been implemented and executed in the interest of improving student performance, but it's a difficult thing to nail down, with wildly varying levels of effectiveness. The achievement gap is among the chief targets of this effort, but it has stubbornly remained, even growing during COVID. And much to the frustration of school administrators and teachers who are doing everything they can think of to shrink this thing. There are some who make the argument, saying that the gap can't really be shrunk, that at best we can only raise all boats. Worse, there are those who still unfortunately find traction with blatantly racist ideas that the stubbornness of the achievement gap validates inherent superiority and inferiority ideas. Whether more benign or more hostile, both are missing the mark and shouldn't be listened to. Perhaps the foremost scholar in our nation whose work can take us forward dramatically is a scholar who has written definitive work on the nature of stereotype threat. This work is incredibly compelling in large part because the effects of stereotype threat can be observed, in a controlled experiment, before your very eyes, and then can also be immediately reversed. The shorthand explanation is that anyone dealing with any kind of self-consciousness is essentially distracted, dividing their cognitive resources between competing impulses and isn't operating free and clear to focus on the learning at hand. And this happens, in a general sense, with minority students. All the time. It follows, then, that this scholar says that sense of inclusion is the metric that will make the difference, but he also acknowledges we don't quite have it figured out yet. Again, it's tough to implement. And lastly, he, himself a minority, says that minority students have to have more of a sense of optimism about the system that they're operating in order to better be inspired to learn. Cynicism hampers things. All of this dovetails beautifully into a potential solution, and even addresses our great national debates. We can see how the stultifying effects of our polarization goes even further than we realize. Embedded within this polarization is a macro argument over how to present U.S. history. On the one side you have the figurative 1619 argument, and on the other the 1776 argument, 1619 being pretty heavily critical, 1776 pretty heavily laudatory. To make a meaningful effort towards increasing sense of inclusion, I would propose that we need a narrative of U.S. history that is shared, same as the shared meaning communication fundamental. And it must be more optimistic and less cynical. In a future video, I will lay out an entire framework, but broadly considered. A shared meaning of U.S. history I think must recognize the tensions of our founding being a declaration of independence predicated on the collective, interdependent word we. This word essentially begins both the Declaration and the Constitution. The polarization we are facing runs counter to that. This is consistent with what the previous video was about, that our rule of law even is plainly founded on the notion, not just of the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but also then on 12 people agreeing as to what that is. And the enormous magnitude of how race figures into all this, and the forming of a more perfect union and the more perfect we, cannot be understated. And so a framework emerges starting in 1619 but also including 1776. The horrors of land dispossession and slavery and the ongoing injustices still being grappled with are plain. But so too is the idealism of 1776 and that tension of declaring independence from monarchy and autocracy, but doing so as a collective interdependent we, founded on the inherent equality of all men. This truly was revolutionary and is worthy of study. Thus founded, a simpler, more systematic and comprehensible framework of U.S. history then emerges, through the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement onto today. It built to a vital and incisive climax in 1954, when a remarkable American Thurgood Marshall laid plain how separate cannot be equal and is absolutely antithetical to the American mandate of forming that more perfect union. This union is still a work in progress. But it has progressed. And it is worthy of study. So too, though, is the pushback. And there's always been pushback. There are many remarkable clarifying moments throughout American history, but one of the primary ones is George Washington committing to the rule of law and on multiple occasions refusing to become a king here. Again, this was revolutionary. King George III acknowledged as such, admitting that Washington was the greater man. Washington's commitment to that set the precedent of acknowledging the inherent equality of people, the rule of law and the fundamental requirement that is the peaceful transfer of power that lasted for more than 200 years. We are now facing an exercise as a nation, seeing if the rule of law can hold someone accountable for breaking it. This, too, is worthy of study. All of this, then, is fundamentally resting on the intertwined notion of what do we, together, agree to be true. So then, this overarching narrative of American history about the imperfect building of a more perfect union and recognizing the successes we've enjoyed along the way is a more effective way of understanding this sense of inclusion. More perfect union is sense of inclusion. And this, again, is the very metric that is recognized as what can finally shrink the achievement gap that school districts have so long struggled with. For this video, though, that is enough. And while I readily concede that making any changes to accredited curriculums in schools at present is a lengthy and complicated process, I would recommend finding grassroots ways of offering this up and letting the results speak for themselves, and see if any of these repeated crises abate at all. I'd love to discuss this further in person. But first we have one more video, on how math and music figure into all of this. Stay tuned.